welcome back to this module on assessment. I'm Marie Martin and I'll be facilitating the next few sessions that are focused on enhancing your own abilities to effectively assess your learner, whether in the classroom or in the clinical environment. Our session objectives for part one are twofold. One, to define some terms related to assessment, and two, to incorporate past learning on backward mapping as you identify your own assessment approaches. Some learning strategies I'll adopt will include a quiz and question prompt to really further your learning. So let's think about the overarching roadmap for this module. We have part one today, which will be followed by part two, defining types of assessment. In part three, we'll learn more about the learning domains and models and how we might do assessment well. And then lastly, identifying some particular tools and approaches that you can incorporate in your own courses. So, what does the word assessment mean, and what adjectives come to mind when you think about it? How might it differ from feedback, reflection, self-improvement, or even evaluation? Beginner educators may have heard these terms before, but are not completely clear on how they differ, or more importantly, how to apply those concepts to teaching and learning, whether in the environment that you find yourselves in an academic setting or elsewhere. So assessment can be the form of and source of some apprehension. So before we begin, it's worth noting that oftentimes these more negative adjectives are associated with assessment. They can often be counterproductive to improving our own practice. So what if we were to reframe assessment in a way that's captured by these more positive adjectives? Our hope is that you'll leave this module with some new ideas and approaches to assessment that truly are constructive and positive. That requires some defining of terms and understanding concepts. The process of assessment is critical to being an effective teacher and helping our learners progress towards a competency and ultimate success. But assessment alone is not enough. Our trainees must also reflect, seek to improve based on feedback, and overall be evaluated on their performance. But if your feedback is ineffective, if your assessment methodology is ineffective, your students may or may not understand how to improve. Therefore, these should be given as often and in appropriate measure as possible, something that learners even seek out in order to enhance their own knowledge, attitudes, skills, and behaviors. A written evaluation at the end of a course or learning activity that corresponds and aligns with your course goals and objectives that we outlined in Module 3 really help the student to benchmark their own performance based on your expectations. So when we think about assessment, it really is an ongoing process of gathering, interpreting information on a learner's knowledge, their attitudes, skills, behaviors, in comparison to that standard or expectation that you set. The original definition comes from Latin assedere, which means to sit beside. So this original definition suggests that teaching and assessment is something that we do with students instead of to students. A dramatic paradigm shift and something that we'll explore in this module. Thinking about appropriate assessment and effective assessment requires that you know what you're assessing and for what purpose. Here are some different kinds of assessment that include at the institutional level, strategic plans, at the accrediting body level for assessing standards for particular kinds of learners, program departments assessing program competencies, and for the purposes of this course, classroom content assessment. So it's vital that you know what you're assessing and for what purpose. So some of these other approaches may use similar tools, similar strategies, but they may differ as well. So understanding assessment and the context is important, as is understanding feedback. So feedback is both information, but it's also a process. If we think about information, it's on performance of our learner, which is always used as a basis for improvement. It's also a process for giving that information, often based on direct observation of the learner's performance. So it's in comparison to a standard, that goal that you've already identified for the course. It's given, as I mentioned, as an attempt to improve behavior and as a pathway for success. And it really should be outlined from the very beginning, from the course syllabus. For example, students will reflect on feedback and demonstrate improvement. So feedback is not a compliment. It's not generalized statement or empty praise. It should be really substantial and substantive information on the improvement for that learner. So it can be verbal or it can be nonverbal. It depends on the context. But for example, if you give feedback on an assessment that's been given, let's say a test or a quiz, the learner may gain information on their performance on that assessment and even receive an evaluation or a grade. But that may or may not stimulate them to reflect and improve. Feedback is really incomplete, and it lacks direction for improvement unless it's incorporated intentionally in the course design. So you as an instructor can really provide feedback that gives a direction and a path for improvement, and also is positive and supportive reinforcement of what has been done well. So when you're giving feedback and they're receiving it is a process of reflection, self-reflection, and improvement. So considering feedback and then analyzing that in an effort to improve learning. Lastly, when we think about evaluation, this is the process of making qualitative judgments or value statements about a person's work or performance. That's again in comparison to a standard, an expectation, recording it in some permanent record. So when you deem a student excellent, for example, you're making a final judgment on their ability as having done something in comparison to a standard. So they've exceeded a standard if they're excellent. Evaluation focuses on grades and may reflect classroom components, mastery level. It's usually product oriented. It determines what has been learned and is judgmental. So if we think about these various terms, let's define them through a quiz. So what is assessment? What is feedback? And what is evaluation? I'll ask you to pause the video. So when we think about defining these actual terms, assessment can be considered in light of a comparison to a standard. Feedback is really thinking about information on how to improve for the learner. And then evaluation is a final judgment, usually conducted at the end of a learning experience or a course. So how you incorporate these into your course really requires intentional thought. Now that we have a firm grasp on terms, we can think about how to fit those in to your course session or overall course. In Module 3, you were introduced to using a course map to map out your course to help you determine the essential components. In particular, assessments for this module. Those assessments that build comprehension and application of learning material, leading to an achievement of an expected outcome or goal. So as we talked about, these modules or sessions really scaffold your course learning objectives and create a structure, helping you to organize a course and your students to walk through that course. The learning objectives create those standards by which you're measuring and assessing your learner. And the assessments, whether they be formative or summative, Determine the acceptable evidence to know if students are meeting those outcomes, if they've mastered the material. In part 2, we'll explore more deeply formative and summative assessment and how to think about those in your own course map. So thinking about all of these components requires you to align them and harkens back to the backward mapping approach. So if we think about Module 3 and how you can intentionally align your assessment strategy with the other course components, we think about the goals and objectives that you're already developing. You've done that in Module 3. You think about the activities that come in step 3 of the backward design approach. And you think about where we are here in determining acceptable evidence, knowing how our activities meet our goals and objectives. So let's think about some objectives and let's think about some examples. So if our example course objective is that students explain key milestones and debates in the history of anesthesiology, what information will tell us that we've reached this objective, that our learners have mastered this? So here's one example. Your assessment could be that students present no fewer than 10 milestones or debates in the field to the class. And then you think about the activity as students working in pairs to identify and create a timeline of historical moments. So as you'll see, these are all aligned and they're connected, they build upon each other. So the assessment then directly informs the task that we use when we plan our assessments and plan our lessons. So our session objectives for today were to define some of these terms related to assessment and also think about the backward mapping approach in our own assessment strategy. I'll ask you to apply your learning before part 2 to think about various terms presented in this module in relation to your own teaching. How might your future assessment approach be informed by backwards curricular design and some of the information that's presented in this session? I look forward to seeing you in part 2.